Yeah.
Nice. Well, well, thank you so much for dipping into it. It makes it all worthwhile, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And I mean, I had to. There's a few people there are people that we had here that I worked with.
Yeah,
there's some familiar names there.
I'm gonna put some photos up, and every time I do, I feel bad because I Oh, cool.
Yeah.
It's not near the fire, is it?
No, it managed to somehow escape it again, which
Oh, good. Thank goodness.
every year it manages. But yeah,
That was kind of scary. Yeah. Did you spend much time?
Huh?
Did you spend time in Palisades?
Not much, but even some professors that lost their homes, it's just crazy. Yeah.
It's the first time with the food.
Oh, good. I'm very excited. Well, it's just if you just put China in the
Yes.
title these days. To be fair, throw Russia in the mix, and you've got like a quarter of the problem.
200 interviews that caught me. It was like,
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this seminar organized by the Center for Geopolitics. As you can see here, it's a center comprising several institutions. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor David McCourt here to NUPI and the Center for Geopolitics to talk about his new book called The End of Engagement. David is a professor of sociology at UC Davis. Right now he is at the NYU in Abu Dhabi for a year. He has published extensively on foreign policy, the intellectual history of foreign policy thinking. And today he will talk about his new book that I think will interest us not only for what it tells us about the evolution of foreign policy thinking in US strategy, but also for similar types of developments in Norway and in Europe. After David's talk, we will have a panel to discuss the book with Henrik Hiem from the Institute of Defense Studies, Kristin Fjestad from NUPI, and Ivor Newman. Where are you, Ivor? Yeah, he's here somewhere. There you are. From the Fridtjof Nansen Institute. I will be moderating the discussion. The event is being streamed. And with that, welcome, and please, David.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for being here. I was on the way over to NUPI and sort of thought back to how much great research is done here, how many friends I have from here, and what a real sincere pleasure it is to be here. You're all very lucky to share this space, and I'm really glad to be here today. Let's get right into it. To the return of great power politics, the end of the post-Cold War era, the onset of new Cold War, some have said, or the end of engagement, as it is in US-China relations. Now, these terms are often more of a hindrance than a help when it comes to actually trying to say something and explain something. And so too is the attempt to sort of say one coherent thing, one overarching explanation. So I'll avoid those twin traps today if I can. And what I'll do is to try to draw our attention to a more specific object of analysis, which is the dynamics of knowledge production about national security and foreign policy in Washington, D.C. Washington I'm using as a shorthand for the United States, but it actually is a Washington story. Then I'll try and tell you a more specific argument about a more clearly delineated object, which is engagement with China, a strategy of US engagement with China. And then I will hopefully have time to do what we kind of all want to do now, which is speculate about what Trump means for all this and whether this is now just a work of history. Has it happened again? Okay, so it's in Washington, D.C. where we begin, where we have to begin, where you can swing a cat at the corner of 18th and K Street, and you're bound to hit someone who claims to be a China expert who really is one. This did actually happen to me going into Starbucks and standing there next to Scott Kennedy from CSIS. And hang on, you're a China expert. So this is a Washington, D.C. story. There's a permanent conference on China in Washington, D.C. every day, panel discussions, book talks. The background conversations. This is not the same, though, when it comes to Russia. And so I'll be spending most of my time today talking about China. But Russia is not the same. It's not as intense a conversation. Between 1989 and 2015 or so, the number of Russia experts in Washington had severely declined to perhaps dozens, if not even fewer. It's only really since then that the US organizations, many of these are acronyms, but you'll sort of CSIS, Center for New American Security, Atlantic Council, have really tried to retool, if you like, on Russia. So it's how specialists in Washington and beyond make knowledge of other countries. That's where we must locate our understanding of something larger, like the return of great power politics, resisting those grander claims. Now, interest in knowledge communities and experts waxes and wanes, in large part because their influence waxes and wanes. It's more convenient and often easier, therefore, to focus on larger forces, the balance of power, ideology, maybe the role of leaders, to slip into a mode of talking about international politics where advisors and experts and knowledge producers are sidelined. Discussion of hawks and doves is fairly common. It's already a trope under Trump's first administration that he brought in a set of China hawks. I'll try to resist that language and show why it's not particularly helpful. But what I'm trying to do is to help us to think and put on the table knowledge communities first and foremost, however we choose to define those, which we can do in a second. Trying to resist broad journalistic styles of talking about foreign policy and national security, where terms like great power politics make us think that we're talking about something meaningful when we're actually kind of not. Okay, so it's in Washington and its dynamics that we need to focus. Okay. So if you'll permit me then a strong claim, I'm convinced that IR analyses of national security should really always focus in the first instance on knowledge producers. We always should make that reflexive break with the object of analysis to make sure that we're not slipping into common sense folk tales about how foreign policy is made. So what do knowledge communities do? Well, the first thing is they circulate knowledge. That might seem absolutely obvious. But in Washington, D.C., knowledge, what's happening, who is going in under Trump, what are they likely to do, what's happening is the currency with which the production of understanding of other countries it proceeds. Just like in the economy, it's money that makes the world go round. In Washington, D.C., it's who you know, what's happening, how deep is your insight. I got an insight into this because the more people I'd spoken to, the more people wanted to speak to me because maybe I knew something that they didn't. So that's really important to foreground. In so doing then, the members of the community credential individuals for potential roles in government. These two things go hand in hand. Who is a plausible candidate in the next administration? At the same time then, they police the boundaries of foreign policy common sense. They produce and reproduce language that is okay to say, things that are okay to say, things that are not okay to say, who is within the bounds of the normal, and who is a quack at the side that can be ignored. A Gordon Chang on China can be ignored, although not quite so much now. A Chas Freeman on China or a Stephen Cohen on Russia can be ignored because they're outside of the boundaries. And in so doing then, occasionally, and this shouldn't be something we assume, is that they construct and implement national security paradigms, coherent ways of seeing another country as a competitor, as a staunch ally, or as a troublesome partner that needs to be should I let that person join? Sorry, I just dismissed them.
Denied.
Denied. Oops, sorry, I was just like getting rid of them. Okay. Oh, I've lost. Okay, so I don't actually want to go into data methods. I'll leave that for the Q&A if that's all right. Suffice to say that I interviewed everyone that would speak to me and their mother. Yeah, let's just leave that for Q&A. Happy to talk about it, but I think that I've done enough to be able to say some things. Isn't that really always what our methods? Okay, so Trump comes in early 2017, and he facilitates a paradigmatic turnover in how the United States sees China, from something called engagement to something called strategic competition. Okay. Engagement was predicated on bringing China into the international system, and from that, all boats can rise. Strategic competition was predicated. Sorry, I'm seeing various things in my bottom right. You're not seeing them. That's why I'm kind of distracted. Strategic competition is predicated on the idea that the United States and China are locked in a potentially decades-long competition over global primacy, and that the United States needs to set its policy-making, its force posture for that purpose. Now, I'm emphasizing the word paradigm because I don't want to slip into the language of ideas. strategic competition and engagement are not simple ideas. To get us away from that, I think that we need to focus on three aspects to be very clear about what it is that we're trying to explain and understand. So I split up engagement and strategic competition among frame, policy, and community. And that allows me to try to isolate what I think is the thing that we can actually explain and focus on, rather than getting sucked into debates about what engagement really was, what policy really was. We can focus on the shift from a coherent group of foreign policy experts who promoted engagement, well, that's a little contentious, with a new group called the strategic competitors. Okay, so frame, policy, community is where the action is. As frame, the most coherent place where it's written down is in the May 2020 document, The United States Strategic Approach to the People's Republic of China. I'm sure there should be some more apostrophes in there, but this was the Trump first administration, so we're just going to leave it. And there, what the new Trump administration, or then a couple of years in, did was to lay out a very stylized story about the failure of something called engagement. And this is specific to the United States. I'd like to flag very briefly Ivar's work on Norway, where the whole point in Norway is not to have a policy and not to have a strategy to keep the ministry in line. In the United States, the whole point is to have a strategy, to have a policy. But it wasn't just any sort of strategy. It was a story that the Trump administration told to throw previous sets of experts, the engagers, under the bus. Since 1989, the US policy towards PRC was premised on a hope that deepening engagement would spur fundamental economic and political opening and lead to China's emergence as a constructive and responsible global stakeholder. More than 40 years later, it's become evident that this approach has failed. Engagement was a failure. This is saying the engagers failed. They were naive. They didn't understand China. And therefore, we need a new policy. We need a new approach. As policy, this was a very stylized story. It didn't have to proceed this way. They could have said Xi Jinping has come in and this has changed things. They could have talked about new technological things like AI and electric cars, etc., where US-China competition was going to be more fierce, but they didn't. They created a stylized story about the failure of something called engagement. As policy then, engagement was this nice label that could encompass lots and lots of different things, from strategic and economic dialogues, of which there were multiple over the 2010s. It could also encompass World Trade Organization membership for China. It could encompass diplomatic moves to try to make sure that members of the US government didn't criticize China too much for various things, including snubs of Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, where she got off a plane in Beijing and basically everyone just ignored her. The kind of diplomatic snub that could be taken as evidence of China and the US in strategic competition, but actually at the time was just sort of pushed to one side. So I think that we're on more solid ground then when we focus on people, when we focus on the kinds of people that came into the Trump administration after 2017, rather than focusing on the shaky, vague ground of engagement as frame or engagement as policy, which is what policymakers and knowledge producers in Washington tend to do. What was engagement? Was it a failure? I'm specifically not arguing like that. I talk about why not in the book. I always feel very queasy about putting people's pictures up because, you know, we're all humans. And what I would like to emphasize is what's happening here is not a logic of the trial. I'm not trying to suggest that people are bad and people are good. The people I've spoken to are all trying honestly to understand China. But it just helps us put faces to names. Now, remember, Trump closed the door on what they call the blob, Washington, D.C., and only took in much different kinds of people in his first administration. Remember, a bunch of Republicans had written something called the Never Trump Letter. And so your kind of neoconservative types like Elliot Cohen, your American Enterprise Institute people, many of them had sort of backed away and said, look, we're not going to go in and work for Trump. We think he's dangerous. But the bigger thing is he also said, we're not going to bring in people from a particular group that I call the engagers. People like Susan Shirk, Ryan Haas, Jim Steinberg, Jeff Bader, that had staffed Republican and Democratic administrations all the way back from the normalization of relations in the 1970s. Many of them had actually gone soon after Nixon's opening in 1972. So these weren't just Democrats. They were a group who believed something like that story of engagement, although, again, I'm not going to tie them too much with that. Trump brought in a new set of folks that were different kinds of China experts, and I'll explain more what I mean by that in a second. Matthew Pottinger was his top right, was his main China guy. Matt Turpin to Matt's left was, that reminds me of a joke, basically. Anyone who looks like me or these two in the United States or Britain, you can call Matt, Steve, or Dave, and it's kind of interchangeable. Okay? So I've been teaching in Abu Dhabi. I'm like, you can call me Matt, Steve, Dave. It's not, really not a problem. So Matt, let's just call them all Matt, shall we? Trump brings in people who are convinced that the United States and China are locked in a strategic competition. And that continues under Biden when he brings in Rush and Eli, not Matt's, as well. Now, at this point, you might be saying, hang on. Is he just telling us a hawks and doves story? Out go the doves and in come the hawks. That's not what I'm saying, and I'll explain a little bit more later. And you might also be thinking, hang on, is this not inevitable, right? Xi Jinping got rid of term limits in 2018. We see evidence of human rights abuses in Xinjiang. We see militarization of the South China Sea. Hang on, look, you're focusing on knowledge politics, but really wasn't this always going to happen? My response to that is that there was going to be a hardening of US-China relations in some variety, but we shouldn't lose sight of the immense social achievement that it was to overturn common sense that had been in place for almost 4 decades, and we should recall that presidents had come in from the end of the Cold War onwards saying that they were going to get tough with China, and it ended up not doing it. So we shouldn't sort of play down the social achievement of the shift from the engagers to the strategic competitors. Precisely under the social conditions of the Trump administration, the first one, where, remember, national security advisors came and went every other week, and the fact that they actually stayed around the entire time was itself part of a social achievement. Okay, so Trump's election then is a critical juncture. It opens the door to a group of people convinced that strategic competition was the right way to frame US-China relations and therefore make policy. But the question is how they were understood as legitimate and how those two groups in the first place had crystallized. So foregrounding the Weberian problematic, if you'll allow me a little sociology, which I'm sure you've been getting hints of Bourdieu and the whole thing in the background. I'll just bring it to the foreground for a second. The legitimacy problematic. How were these actually understood as China experts? Why weren't they just quacks? Okay. 3 key processes. I realize I must be Hegelian because everything's just like 3, thesis, antithesis, the whole thing. Can't help it, it's just how it worked out. Okay, so this was the result of 3 processes, and this is where we get into the making and remaking of different groups of kinds of China and Russia experts. Polarization, the formation of the engagers and the strategic competitors, or I call them in the book the anti-engagers, and how that was also tied to distinctions between the kinds of experts they were. They're not the same bases of knowledge, they're not the same credentials, they're not the same institutions, they're not the same backgrounds. And finally, something I can't get into, this is a personal story. We're talking about a community of people who all know each other. It might be, in the Russia side, it's in the dozens, in the China side, it's in the hundreds. But they know each other, like each other, detest each other sometimes. And it is an intensely personal story. Okay, so polarization then was a social differentiation between the engagers and the anti-engagers, between the engagers who, my anti-engager interviewee on the right put nicely, for 40 years we engaged China. We engaged on their advice. The Ken Lieberthals, he was in Carter's administration. Winston Lord, he was former CFR president, and I think he was under Nixon. Stape Roy, Orville Schell, a journalist, all these people, they were all the intellectual foundation for advising every administration, Republican or Democrat, to engage. Now what this person doing is sort of setting up a them to be able to set up a we, sort of classic in-group, out-group stuff. And this is just speaking to that sort of dynamic, that they thought, the engagers thought, that China needed to be kept on side, that engagement was the best process. Now, this is, I think, easier than sort of saying that engagement was a real thing, a real frame, a real policy. What's more concrete is that they understood themselves, the strategic competitors, the engagers, as different. We're saying something different. And here we see an engager, a sort of a senior former policymaker, ambassador actually, saying, you know, that the engagement still works. The idea that engagement has failed is ridiculous. Okay, so a social differentiation. In some ways, I don't find this the most interesting thing. This is sort of like the sort of hawks doves on China. It's just trying to show that polarization was happening. Now, let's flip to Russia, because similar dynamics happened on the Russia side of things as well. There are two fairly coherent groups, which in the book I call the Russia we wanters and the Russia we havers. The Russia we havers are adherents to some what some people call the Tom Graham line. Tom Graham, former national security Russia director and CFR think tank analyst. And others, Sam Charp from RAND, Matthew Rajansky, Emma Ashford. There's a few others that we would say we need to deal with the Russia that we have. We don't like Putin. We don't like what Russia is doing, but we can and should get along with them if we can. Some people might, Matthew Rajansky sort of calls them that annoying third neighbor that you just have to kind of deal with. Tom Graham's more of an old-fashioned IR realist. Great power politics, which is sort of an interesting thing we might have a chance to talk to. The Russia we wanters, by contrast, follow Daniel Fried's line, former ambassador to Poland, and sort of similar positions, that, you know, we can and should try to help younger Russians achieve the Russia that they want and that we want, which is a more open, liberal, possibly even democratic Russia. Tori Newland, Mike McFall, a political scientist, David Kramer, far right, sort of more human rights focused. They are the kind of people that follow the Russia we want line. One Russia expert explained to me that it's not about the people have their ideas. He follows Carl Jung and says, actually, ideas have their people. There are these two ideas, not just hawk dove, but we can and should try to push Russia in a particular direction. We shouldn't. Okay. Now, importantly, where Trump, his election facilitated a paradigmatic turnover on China, no such paradigmatic turnover was forthcoming when it came to Russia. The Russia we have we're not in a position of dominance before, and they're not in a position of dominance now. In fact, in some ways, the group has actually dissipated. Matthew Rajansky's sort of given up. Sam Charap is sort of probably heading that group. But in some ways now, they actually become more critical of Russia than the Russia we wanters, whose worldview has sort of been vindicated. There was no paradigmatic turnover. The closest thing we see is the push and the occasional call for what we call a reset. You know, I'm sure if you read Foreign Affairs, every so often someone calls for a reset. And it's a particular part of the Washington dynamic. It's sort of like, it's calling for a more dovish policy without calling for a more dovish policy. And in 2009, Mike McFall was one of the key proponents of the reset. where, I don't know if you remember this, but Clinton and Lavrov actually pushed a big red button with reset on it. But it was translated wrongly, and it wasn't reset, it was something else. I don't know if you remember what it was, but it said,
Shortcut.
Sorry.
Shortcut.
Shortcut, right. So just really it encapsulates the kind of nonsense of the idea. Anyway, so there was an attempt to create a reset. And interestingly, after the reset was done with Medvedev in power, and it failed, obviously. Putin comes back in. But it's after that point that really the Russia we want to, and the Russia we have a groups consolidate, because McCourt, prior to that, had been sort of on the idea that, we can actually do business with Russia. Him, Celeste Wallander, who'd been another person pushing for the reset, really firmly move into the Russia we want camp. So these things are always fluid, they're always changing. I don't want to suggest that they are always and forever. Okay. Now, to return to the China specialists, for a paradigmatic turnover from engagement to be possible, it wasn't enough that you just had the engagers and the strategic competitors. They've always been strong critics of China, the dragon slayers versus the panda huggers, the hawks versus the doves. Yeah, I love that kind of stuff. Panda sluggers is another one. Anyway, they had to be legitimate. Now, in part, Trump's willingness to bring in wild cards like Peter Navarro, who's back, actually, an economic history professor who apparently Jared Kushner had Googled tough on China and got Peter Navarro. This may be apocryphal, but I totally see it happening. He went in, and others like Pottinger went in as well. But for the strategic competitors to be a legitimate group, there had to not only be divisions over policy, over worldview, there also had to be differences over what it means to be a China specialist. And here we see, I think, a really important dynamic, which is professional status competition. The engagers and the strategic competitors were different. The engagers were more tied to China itself. They spoke good Chinese, they had Chinese friends. I went to a few of their houses, and they were lined with script, vases, which I was very careful not to knock over. They served Chinese food. Turns out I'm terrible with chopsticks, so I was hungry for a lot of my research. That's actually kind of true. So we see here on the left an engager saying, well, actually, it's impossible for normal people to spot the difference between who is a China expert and who isn't a China expert. Or who are actually just trying to bring over their Russia expertise or IR general expertise. Now, everyone's a Russia and China person in Washington, D.C., and you actually see Mike McFall pop up, Hal Brands, Tom Wright. A bunch of China experts are actually reschooled Soviet experts. Kurt Campbell, for example, Liz Economy, they were Russia experts that have managed to try to translate the story of translation from one form of expertise to another one. The engagers hewed closer to sinology. They were focused on engaging with a small e in many ways, going there, trying to engage and talk to the Chinese. Similar dynamics happen on Russia, which we can touch upon in the Q&A. The strategic competitors weren't China experts in the same way. They, before 2012, one former intelligence officer in the US military or US Navy stationed in Hawaii said, pro-engagement experts ridicule people like me, they mocked us. They said they were sort of knuckle draggers, was the phrase he used to me, said we're uneducated. And he's annoyed because he's saying, look, we were actually reading what Xi Jinping was saying. We were reading the cables that were coming in. We were seeing Chinese submarines popping up beyond the first island chain, which officials were saying wasn't happening, and standing up and saying, well, hang on. And then you turn around to tell us, and we're not invited to your CSIS, CFR gig, right? We're China experts in the same way. Okay, I realize time is marching on, so I'll keep rolling and try to focus on this last dynamic, which is the dynamic of personal likes and dislikes. So alongside professional status competition is a personal differentiation, not just a polarization on you think this about China and you are this kind of China expert, but simply who do you like and dislike? So one of the things I asked them all was, okay, I'm going to buy you a beer. Now you can have a beer with Dan Fried, or you can have a beer with Mike McFall, or you can have a beer with Tom Graham. And it was really where they started to light up. They were like, well, I had a beer with Tom Graham last night. Yeah, we're all buddies. Dan Fried, not so much. Or, you know, I'd have a beer with any of them. You know, I don't mind. And that's someone trying to position themselves in the middle. Sort of a Fiona Hill, Andrea Kendall-Taylor on the Russia side, a Jude Blanchett from CSIS on the China side. It was where you really see the social dynamics when you say, you know, who are you friends with? Who do you like? Who do you not like? So these are people's careers, many of them in the 70s and 80s, particularly when it comes to, well, on both sides actually, with Putin and the war in the Ukraine and China and Xi Jinping. Some of them either see their lives as being vindicated. Look, I was right all along. China is going to collapse. Gordon Chang, I'm sure, has tweeted that today. Actually, I might have wasted my life. So there's a lot of vindication in those marginalized China hawks. We were right. Or one explained a former businessman who'd been very, very key in the 1980s in bringing China into, opening up China for business, member of the US China Business Council. You know, he feels like no one wants to listen to him anymore because, you know, how does he stay relevant? How does he stay a member of this China expert community when he's still sort of, people think he's starry-eyed on China, that, you know, he's just drank the Kool-Aid. And this is my favorite one. This is from a senior political scientist who was definitely an engager for the longest time and has turned out to, is now a very strong China critic. Petty bourgeois narcotics and neurotics tend to have their own identity. Yeah, narcotics are probably a bit better. Whether it's their farm, their small business, or their intellectual positions. I'm included in this. We are sick people. We really, really care and identify ourselves with these things we thought about. They spend their days on listservs, going to tweeting, going to events, trying to still understand this thing that they've spent maybe the last 30 or 40 years trying to understand, and it didn't turn out the way that they think. And I think it's really important to always bear this in mind, away from the policy, away from the framework, that these are real people, these are real investments. When you choose to go in and work for someone, that's maybe the thing that people will remember you for. I don't have time to. Yeah, I know this was always wishful thinking, but it's briefly to say that Biden brought in people from the strategic competitor group as well. And if we had more time, I could zoom in, because this is always about individuals, right? Like Kurt Campbell goes in and he brings in Rush Doshi and Matt, and they're all strategic competitors. They're not engagers. So a big puzzle that actually emerged as I was doing the research, as I was actually trying to tell the story about what happened under Trump, was why Biden didn't go back to the engagers. He went to the strategic competitors. And the key thing there is that as Trump developed strategic competition, it put the old engager crowd, it posed a question. Do you get on the train that is leaving the station, as they say in DC, or do you try to defend this old thing? Kurt Campbell, Rush Doshi, Laura Rosenberger and others, they were like, no, strategic competition is the way forward. We need to accept that language and try and theorize it. And so now, really, they're the ones on the outside that are still trying to think about, but still talking the language of strategic competition. Now, I think I'm probably out of time, right?
You can go for a few more minutes.
Okay, well, I've only got a few more minutes, so that's cool. So let's do the thing that we all really want to do, which is be like, let's pretend we're in Washington, D.C. and not doing the whole like academic thing and be like, right, what's actually happening? Who have you spoken to? Has Trump's second election thrown all of that out of the window because he's not bringing in recognized China experts at all this time? Which The Wire China tells us kind of nicely, which I want to talk to. But The Wire China is an online newsletter that focuses on the kind of on China Matters, and they helpfully like talk about all of the different kinds of people that have gone in, and it's interestingly they don't do engagers and strategic competitors. They do establishment hawks, pro-business executives, and wild cards. So Elon Musk's a wild card, Pete Hegseth's a wild card, Tulsi Gabbard's a wild card, and the Reds are like standard hawks, right? So Marco Rubio. So it turns out that Marco Rubio is sort of the most credentialed China expert at this point. Sorry, I know this is putting stuff that I told you. This is breaking all of PowerPoint rules. We can talk about this more. But the main points are China experts have been pushed to one side. Real card-carrying, China-speaking, even if it's AEI or Heritage or neoconservatives, they're not in the conversation. We've got your tech bros, Alex Karp from Palantir, and others who are trying to push forward strategic competition because they know that opens the spigot of congressional funding, and we're talking trillions of dollars that they're going to make. And then you've got your Elon Musk types who, if you can sort of find the time between buying OpenAI and shutting down the government, then he might push Trump towards some sort of grand bargain with Xi. That's not off the table. So it has really kind of blown up this standard story of putting into place strategic competition. We really don't know, is the headline point. Okay, I will leave it there. I won't leave my book up, I'll leave this up, and I'm happy to talk through any and all of that. Thank you so much for listening.
So we'll just rearrange a little bit here. If you can stand here somewhere, David, and then if the
like a wine bar.
Come up. Ivor, Henrik, Kristin, please.
Engagers.
This is great.
I'm going to fall off at some point. It's going to happen.
So what we'll do is like with the presidential debate, opening statements from the panelists. I think we'll start with you, Ivor, please.
Oh, well, in that
That's
case,
okay.
Let me start by congratulating you with your book.
So much.
It's an interesting book, and it's a good book. I'm not here to tell you how good it is. I am here to tell
What's wrong with it?
people, no, I am here to open a discussion where we can try and sort of push on, as it were.
Yeah.
Let me just start by saying that I think you're absolutely right. Engagement is over. I regret that as not only as a Russianist, but also as a student of diplomacy. I think this is simply the wrong way to go. Well, there we are. My first thing, and that would be more of a question, and I think I know what you will say. You stake a lot on this Russia we have, Russia we want, China we have, China we want, and then you pull back at a number of places that, oh, people are really in the middle. You did it in this talk as well. So you explode it, you de-differentiate it. I think you shouldn't have used it in the first place, because phenomenologists tell us that when we act, we always have an expectation of what the future will bring, what the effects will be, which means that what we have and what we want are always part of the same equation, as it were. So it does work for you, but I think you could have done without it. When one says something nasty, one should also say something nice. So let me congratulate you with what you're saying about the hierarchies inside the Chinese and Russian milieus. I trained as a Russianist. I trained with Mike McCourt. And this was the talk. This was how we positioned ourselves. When did you first go to Russia? How much time do you spend there? How many of the newspapers do you read, etc.? I always came up badly in that one because I only followed one. But this was, I think you're spot on that. It's, I think it's inevitable. You're a sociologist. The sociology of professions tells us that there is no such thing as a non-hierarchized profession. So I think you could also have pushed on there a bit. Third thing would be things that you're not looking at, that I think you should look at. I hope you're going to continue with this research. The whole question, you refer to the classic on Sovietologists in the US and you say, I don't want to look at this because he's taking care of it. I don't think that's necessarily a right decision, because area studies were institutionalized as a prop for the government for the Cold War. I mean, we know this. And this is only 3 generations ago, which means that it's very much with us. The tutors of these people's tutors, their grandfathers and grandmothers, as it were the pioneers. And that means that the kind of ideological inculcations that were made are still with us. You make the point yourself, which means that the origins of the thing, the political sort of basics of it, are still with us. That could have been more to the fore. I also wondered why you didn't draw on Christina Garsten's anthropology work on American think tanks, where she goes into the financial side of things. It's at the University of Stockholm. You said it's money versus networks. She would argue that it's money and networks. And having worked in think tanks for half of my career, I would concur. You have no idea. You people working in universities have no idea how much time we spend on actually getting the money. So it's a bit like war and economics. You need economics to wage war. Well, you can't do the networking without having the money, because without the money you don't have a job. Could I have 2 more short points? You mentioned Bourdieu in passing, and as a sociologist, I was surprised you didn't use him more, because I think this whole work that you're doing here is mapping beautifully onto his 3 kinds of capital. You mentioned Stephen Cohen, that he wasn't taken seriously. Now, Stephen Cohen is politically I would agree that he's been naive for almost 40 years. But Stephen Cohen is also the academic who wrote the definitive biography of Bukharin, who was a key figure in the Russian Revolution. So he has, his cultural capital is through the roof, right? You say his social capital is zilch. That would have been a nice way of sort of going. One of the many points in the book where I just laughed out loud was when you detail how Fiona Hill is introduced to President Trump for the first time as the one who wrote the best book on Putin, which I think is a correct description, by the way. And Trump says, no, Russia is Rex. He's done trillions of deals with the Russians. So what he's doing there, he says economic capital trumps cultural capital, bugger off, basically. So you could have used a Bourdieusian thing to demonstrate this, and then we could also have had the question to what you end with, what's in store. I think what's in store is that economic capital will now trump all other kinds of capitals, hook, line, and sinker, basically. And this is not good news for politics. I think this is going to be a disaster for the US. Economics can be very dangerous stuff. Final point. You make a big point of Fiona Hill speaking broad Northern English dialect and how that sort of plays into the situation. You speak Northern English dialect yourself, don't you?
Yeah.
You're from Birmingham, I would guess?
I'm from about 50 miles from where she grew up.
Yeah, there you are.
The same person, basically.
Well, she's also met, right? Yeah. Well, anyway, why the heck don't you go into what that does to your work? You're a sociologist. I mean, where is the positionality? Where is the situatedness here? You may say that it's irrelevant, but my experience with Americans is that they're super interested in where people are from, and if they're from Europe, if they're from Britain, if they're from Northern England, it should have some kind of effect. Thank you.
So, is it okay, David, if we do all 3?
Sure, yeah.
So, Henrik and then Christian.
Sure, thanks. I also really liked reading this book. It's
well written, engaging, and it gives us a very good framework for thinking about the engagement debate, I think, which has been sort of frustrating for me to follow, and I think the book provides a very good sort of framework for understanding that whole engagement debate. So I enjoyed that. It's also interesting because it's about a topic I care deeply about, China policy, and more specifically, of course, people involved in China policy, academics and think tankers, right? What a fascinating topic, obviously. No, I really enjoyed it. I think I want to touch on two things. The first thing is the relevance of the story you're telling here for Europe. Because, at the outset, obviously, this is very much a story about Washington, D.C. and policymaking in the U.S. And, that is a thing quite unlike what we have in Norway and most European countries, the revolving door policy you have in Washington, how these people would go in and out of government. So in a way, you could sort of argue that, the China-watching community and probably the Russia-watching community would have more policy influence, perhaps, in the US than they do, you would see typically in Europe. But I still think there are several reasons why the story you're telling here is relevant for us too. One thing is that the shift in the debate or intellectual climate, perhaps even in the paradigm that you're describing in this book, we haven't seen it to the same extent here, but we're definitely seeing some of it, quite a bit of it. European policy on China has shifted too, and the strategic competition sort of paradigm, if you want to call it that, is increasingly being adopted here as well. I think part of that is because of sort of macro level forces and shifts in Chinese behavior, greater Chinese assertiveness and all that. But I also think we've seen some similar types of developments as the ones you describe in this book, how the field has been expanded with more people entering debates about China, typically people with more of a security studies background, general IR specialists. So it has broadened up, and I think that has affected the debate in similar ways as what you described. I also think American debates have a profound effect on us because, especially in the China field, they have dominated knowledge production on China, Chinese foreign policy for decades. This field has been, it's been very, very small in Europe. It's growing a bit, but the Americans are still dominating. So for that reason, I think a lot of the knowledge produced in the field is influencing debates here as well. And then I think one interesting question to ask is that a good thing? And I think the picture is mixed. There's a lot of good work being done with China watchers in the community in the US. But I also think there are some problematic aspects of this, sort of uncritically adopting the strategic competition frame in Europe, especially because, most European countries, their interests aren't always perfectly aligned with that of the US. And I think there's been a little bit of an unfortunate tendency there in some areas. I want to touch on one other thing too. I want to push back a little bit on one sort of broad point that you make in the book. In essence, you're sort of telling a bit of a bottom-up story, right, about China and Russia watchers and how they influence policy, and that there's a tendency to exaggerate sort of the macro-level forces and how they influence policy. And while I think that's extremely worthwhile, and I sympathize with it, I agree with it to a certain extent, I think there are points in the book where you underestimate some of the sort of profound shifts and how macro-level forces and top-level policymakers have sort of set the terms for what is sort of acceptable to say and set the terms for debates in very powerful ways. And I think one way to look at this is to look at a few sort of critical junctures where you could ask the counterfactual. Counterfactuals are dangerous, but nevertheless, could policy have shifted? Why did engagement sort of, dominate for so long? One such juncture would be after the fall of the Berlin Wall and, more importantly, the Beijing massacre in 1989, right? Where there were a lot of people who were much more skeptical about China for obvious reasons, right? But where high-level policymakers intervened, people like James Baker was very clear on, how China was too important to U.S. global interests to sort of isolate, and hence, the engagement line continued to dominate for a decade. Right. Another such juncture would be the incoming of the second Bush administration, where there were, and you mentioned this in the book, a group of more China-skeptical people. Nina's Love has written about this, right? Who were sort of entering the fray. They were trying to, establish a tougher policy on China, at least shift away from engagement. But then 9/11 happened, and these people were just sort of pushed aside. There was no sort of way these people could succeed in the world that was happening after 9/11. Their policy influence just waned dramatically. So if we fast forward to the current day, I think it's useful to ask whether it's conceivable that U.S. policy could shift back towards engagement again. And you kind of ask that question in the conclusion in the book, right? And I want to read, you say that an economic and military peer of the United States, any renewed engagement would be based on cold realpolitik, not optimism about what the future might bring. To me, that sounds a little bit like saying that macro-level forces are making a return to engagement basically impossible, right? So, this is a disagreement about degree. It's not a fundamental disagreement about the importance of this community, because I think that is very much real. But I think the book at places could have emphasized some of these critical junctures and some of these powerful forces even more. But again, great book, and I enjoyed reading it. Great. Kristin?
Thank you so much. Thank you, David, for coming to NUPI and presenting this really fascinating book. And thank you, Jakob, for inviting me to read and comment. My points are slightly similar to some of the ones that have already been raised, but I wanted to maybe try to bring us a little bit more to Norway and to Europe and also to today, because so I can pick up on some of the things that Ivar and Henrik said. But one thing that I wanted to ask you about that I think is important is that, so the book contains many different stories in a way, right? But the main story is about how the policy shift, the shift in policy towards China came about. What I thought was interesting when reading it was that in many of the documents that you cite, there is actually a description of both Russia and China very often. So there is a pairing of the two that I think we see very clearly also in how, especially now after February 2022, but also before that, there was this kind of increasing focus on the two of them working together, becoming more powerful, influencing world politics in different ways. So I wanted to ask if it's kind of, how do you think like this story would look if you had, so is it a question of the China and Russia expert communities, or is it more a story of the national security military communities kind of winning? So it's kind of a broader question about how that, and the pairing of the two, where I think that also during the Obama administration, you write that there is a broader shift from terrorism being the main security focus to this interstate strategic competition, and that's well ahead of Trump and kind of the change to the strategic competitors. So related to that is also this idea of kind of the liberal democracies versus the rising autocracies of the world, which has become much more dominant, I think. And I also wanted to ask you if related to this, do the China experts talk about Russia at all? And do the Russia experts talk about China at all? So to what extent do they do this pairing, or do they see themselves as very separate expert communities? And And then we've talked about how this is very much like a Washington, D.C. story, and I think it's really impressive, the empirical work that you've done in mapping out and talking to people in Washington. But I think this picks up on what Henrik said about the influence that, you know, the thinking and the knowledge that is produced in Washington has in Europe, which I think, and in Norway, which I think is very, very important. So that's why this is a very interesting book also to us. But what about the other way around? So what about kind of outside input to the think tank and the expert communities in Washington? You make some mentions of Eastern European think tanks with relations to Eastern Europe. You make a mention of an Australian, like some Australian thinking on, but at least to me there seems to be like there is a trend here going from Australia, Canada, the US maybe coming towards Europe when it comes to how we frame and the policies that kind of fit within that framing towards China. Maybe not so much so on Russia, and I think that's maybe something that we can discuss, that's maybe a bit different in that regard. And then and then I also wanted to pick on some questions regarding the personal stories, which I also find very fascinating. And then I also, as maybe you also said when you said that it's uncomfortable to show the photos, like I wanted to ask you a little bit about kind of the kind of research ethics, and in some parts of the book you talk a little bit about kind of, you know, almost a slightly kind of counterfactual what would have happened if Hillary Clinton won the election, a little bit into Fiona Hill's mind in like how she came into the White House versus Matthew Pottinger, for example. So could you say a little bit about how you've kind of gone about relating to your interviewees and also your own position now becoming a China expert through studying China experts, perhaps. And then finally, I think that on the Russia side, I do, of course, there are very many things that you wrote in the book that made me think both kind of professionally and personally on kind of the Russia expert community in Norway and how, of course, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine was an incredibly critical juncture on that and kind of shifted a lot of things around, I think, when it comes to who is an expert and what does it take to be an expert, what does it mean to be an expert when it comes to Russia. So that's also something that we can maybe talk more about. And since your interviews was done before that, I wanted if you could share some reflections on what's the state of the Russia expert community today.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, back to you, David. Quite a few things.
Okay, and I also want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for all of you people who've come. Okay. Right. So I've thank you so much for those, and I'm sort of glad that you said about Russia we have versus Russia we want, because to be honest, I picked them fairly quickly and probably should have given it a bit more thought as to whether those were the best labels. What I was trying to do was use labels that came from the interviewees themselves, but also not ones that were too in the field such that they were already polluted. Engager actually kind of became polluted at the time, so it was trying my best to thread that needle between making sort of a reflexive epistemological break to the object of analysis, but without doing it in a way that when they read it, they don't understand what it is that I'm talking about, using sort of too much sociological speak. Could I, and therefore, and I think this is probably what you assumed I would say is, you know, if I could have done without it, what kind of other device could I have used? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts that would have actually put the two groups, made them coherent and they're explicable to the readership. And there, I'll actually sort of confess another thing, which is that my groupings confuse another kind of difference between the two, which is that the Tom Graham line is a sort of a realist IR line, which is kind of different to the engager line, which isn't which is more of a we like China and should get along with them, rather than we don't like Russia but we have to get along with them anyway. That actually speaks quite directly to Ivor's other point, which is that these groups actually come out from the DNA of the American foreign policy field itself, sort of realism, sinology and area studies. On the Russia side, transitology, that old sort of the old political science group, the political scientists who in the early 90s were sort of trying to figure out the transition from communism to democracy. These things are structuring factors that are just really complex, and I had a go, but I definitely don't think that I did it perfectly. I'm just not sure whether one can do it perfectly. Which then brings you to the question of, whether, to what extent using Bourdieu more clearly would have helped. I think it would, but this was the policy book. There is another sociology book this was the book that because I watched engagement fall, like I was there in DC in 2016 when I started, people were still talking in those ways, and then it went, and I was writing some of this stuff in 2018, but we know that political science takes a long time to get anything out, so it turns out to be 2022 before the journal article version of it. And this is just a really sort of interesting thing that I found, that the political world moves very quickly and the academic world moves very slowly. So I took a jump at the policy story. So there is more to come.
Right?
Say again?
That's why we have foreign affairs.
That's why we have foreign affairs, which is a big problem. Christina Garston, I didn't know about that work. I'll just read it. Just straightforwardly confess that I wasn't aware of that. But you are absolutely right. Going back to Bourdieu, the cultural capital versus economic capital is something that I avoided a little, just again because I didn't want to make this particular book I buried the theory to try to make it accessible to a wide audience. But you're absolutely right about the cultural capital now, those with cultural capital being sort of on the outside, and the extent to which some of the older engagers certainly had lots of cultural capital. In some ways, it was a mix of cultural capital. So, for example, Winston Lord is from the old Pillsbury family. So, Pillsbury dough, flour. And so he's an elite, right? He's a cultural elite. If you're the CFR president, you're a cultural elite. If you are a professor at SAIS, you're a cultural elite. And then for a long time, I think the engagement position was backed up by a combination of political, economic, and cultural capital in ways that I don't capture well enough in the book. But that really is important. And it's important now vis-a-vis, can any cultural elite, apart from LeBron James, actually stand up to Elon Musk? I'm not sure. I mean, I say that sillily, but Beyonce actually does have that kind of capital right in the field of power. Okay, so economic capital is a win. Disaster for the United States. Your question about Fiona Hill, I think, speaks to your question about where am I in this, and so yeah, Fiona Hill has an accent. It's not quite the same as mine, but she's from northeast England, and I'm from northwest England, and we sort of connected on that basis. And during the impeachment of Trump, she did sort of go into this story, and she and I spoke about people who go to the United States because there's nothing for you in northeast England. I again didn't want to go into that too much. There's a little bit of it in the methodological appendix in the other book. There's going to be more of it. Do I think that it? Do I think it matters? Of course it matters. I think, but I didn't want to do the IR autoethnography thing because I'm actually quite skeptical of the putting yourself in too much. I'd rather do it as at a structural level, your position in the field. I was more interested in thinking about the sociological position as you enter the field. And it's interesting that you say, now that I tried to resist as long as I could, but the field pulled me in. Like the gravity of the field pulled me in. As I have spoken to more and more people, journalists wanted to speak to me, interviewees would speak to me because they thought that maybe I had some of this little thing called China capital. Maybe I had some that they could gain. And I was more interested in that kind of sociological insight rather than the fairly obvious things. My interview hit rate was like 98%. Everyone I emailed said yes. Partly that's just because think tankers speak to people, but partly because they assumed either I was American, again, Matt, Dave, or Steve, University of California, I had professor already, male, heterosexual, all of those things I think really mattered so that I could speak to anyone in the field at any point. I say that I think in the methodological appendix. I'm really sort of trying to be as open as I can about those kinds of issues. But as soon as people started to see, hang on, he's probably dovish, right? He's probably a panda hugger. So I'm now just fully out. I think most people my wife calls me a panda hugger, which is kind of nice. But anyway, she's a strategic competitor. What can you do? You can imagine. That's why I'm away for Valentine's Day, by the way. Okay, so we can speak more about that. I'm really interested by those kinds of issues. Okay, so relevance for Europe. Yes. Oh no, actually, sorry. I'll just pick up on your pushback about top-level policymakers and macro forces, and basically that's the kind of stuff that has kept me up all night for the last 10 years because it's just so difficult to make that break when macro forces they feel that you feel it at a bodily level when you're trying to explain to someone and talk to someone about, well, US-China relations were bound to shift, weren't they? Sorry, I'm trying to use these kind of. That's how it felt to me. If Clinton got in, you would have still seen the same kinds of things. Or if 9/11 hadn't have happened, Bush Junior's foreign policymakers would have facilitated something like strategic competition. And so really the answer shifts then to one of trying intellectually to resist that almost bodily pull towards these macro forces of the balance of power, of US hegemony being challenged, and therefore these, I think, logics of inevitability. So in some ways I'm more interested in the social weight in a conversation in Washington or beyond, or in the writings of a journalist that move us and convince us without much in the way of evidence often. But that's not to say that it's not real, and not just in the weight in the argument, but it's also real in the world. Like we act upon it. So absolutely. Okay. Impact of European or the American debate in Europe and Europeans over in the United States. How can I push that one? I portray this as only an American thing, and it's not. The debates are global and transatlantic. The McCourt Institute in Berlin, I think it is, has been a very, very important node. The ASPI in Sydney has been, in Canberra has been a really important node. That's an Australian policy institute. In many ways, they went first in terms of changing their view on China. Went and position are kind of important, like topographical metaphors that are really important when you're talking about China and other things, like where you stand and when did you go on China. People will say McCourt went early, ASPI went early, and they've been important at the individual level. I tend to see this in Borgesian terms of the exportation and importation of palace wars. You know, how people use capital that they've got from the strength of an argument at McCourt, take it into Washington D.C. and use it as a form of capital. And interestingly, you don't see it the other way. It only has moved in a hawkish sort of direction. It's only moved in a critical direction. You don't see, well, those Australians are really getting along with the Chinese now. Why don't we? I don't see that dynamic. And that would be something interesting to talk about, and why. Where is Russia now? Or this Russia-China pairing thing that you pick up on, I think, and this could be wrong, but I think really that Russia was just an afterthought. And it's sort of like, oh yeah, Russia too. I think that the thinking on strategic competition started in the Department of Defense under a guy called Robert Work at the Office of Planning, or one of those kind of shadowy organizations in the Pentagon. And they were starting to think about how they could offset some advantages that China has in terms of military power in its near region, and how they could offset that by technological means, thinking about competition with China for the next few decades. I don't think Russia was really thought of in much, partly because I don't think there were many Russia experts who knew anything about the Russian military in 2012, 2013. And I think it was just kind of tacked on towards the end, since there's been more of a concern about authoritarian, sort of an authoritarian axis, that Russia's become more meaningfully incorporated alongside Russia, but alongside China. But really, I think it's kind of still an afterthought, at least until Trump comes back in. And so the Russia expert feel the Russia we have as, even though we perhaps don't like that term, are firmly on the outside now. I said one of them sort of disappeared. A lot of them are on the senior end of things, because part of the dynamic that I can't emphasize is that people retire. People in Washington don't retire like us lazy Europeans do. They die at their desks, but they do die, and their ideas die with them, and that's sort of an important dynamic. At some point, I had to make a decision whether I was going to interview this 90-year-old. Because, are they still relevant? It's really sad, actually, to think about. But, it is what it is, right? I got close to chatting to Kissinger. A guy died on me. It was, I thought, a bit rude. But don't put that on the internet. Okay. I think that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Phil. Those are all really, really helpful.
Okay, let's open up for a few questions and comments from the audience. I see 3 hands, Halvard, and there, and there. So we'll collect them and then back to you guys. Please.
Hi, Halvard Eira, I'm one of the research directors here. Thanks for coming back, David. Good to see you. Great talk. I want to pick up on something that Ivor raised and you sort of touched upon as well, which I think might have sort of influenced possible ways of thinking about change. I mean, you talk about the different positions, and then you touched upon sort of the grounding in, call it political science or underlying science here. And you've written about this 70 years ago in the Council of Foreign Relations and the birth of international relations and all that stuff. So how does this latch on? Or you said it's complicated, but that's sort of, it's complicated.
Yeah.
We all know that. That's Facebook's whole line, right? That the status is complicated. But how does this latch on to IR theory? And does any of that matter now if Ivor is correct in that it's now all economic capital anyway, so all the intricacies of political science and international relations theories are out the window? Or sort of is there still a theoretical push and pull that we could sort of think might have some influence down the line?
Okay. Then there, we'll collect it. Yeah.
Yes. My name is Morten Williamson, and I want to know what do you mean about Trump's politics in Ukraine, about the conflict between Ukraine and Russia. It's very different from Biden's politics.
Thank you. My name is Hannah Weber. I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. And my question is kind of maybe even an idea for a new book of yours, or kind of ask you to be a bit like predictive, almost looking in the future, because I was wondering, of course, you look at China on the one hand, Russia on the other hand. But I mean, especially as you talk about the Trump effect, which I think is brilliantly put actually, how are we going to look at Europe in a couple of years to come, right? Do you already maybe have a bit of a sense of how this expert community or knowledge community around EU politics, then European topics, is developing now or is going to emerge in the upcoming years? And will you be able to maybe talk about that in a similar way almost, rather than like a very close ally and partner, to think of it as an adversary almost, or, you know, talking about terrorists, etc., etc. So, yeah.
All right.
Yeah, great. Okay, so IR theory. The only hints that I got really from the interviews was with Tom Graham line on Russia being a realist-inspired line. Because, I mean, the other person that popped up was Mearsheimer quite a bit. And Mearsheimer's taken, well, he's partly taken seriously and partly not taken seriously. Like, he's taken seriously by some who don't really know that realism is a dinosaur in IR. But So that speaks to the issue of changes in international relations such that IR kind of doesn't exist in America. I mean, we know this, right? We hang out at ISA. Like, I think that really came home to me, that American political science is just a very different beast. And so political scientists are a big part of the field. And Rand Corporation and others are busy hiring every Russia PhD that they can at the moment. But they're not IR people in the way that I understand IR. Because now how it is in the United States, there's European-style IR. That's what I do. That's how I get merits in my department at Davis. He does. This is what the dean says in his letters. He's well respected in his field of European-style IR. And then there's contemporary IR theory, and that means political science. That's your APSA, APSR stuff. And that's actually pretty much absent in the conversation on Russia, really. The participants who've gone to Harvard, they've gone to MIT, or maybe not just those universities, they're taking part, but it's not an active part of the debate. Now, in some ways, that actually then becomes an argument for us all to lean back into realism and to start and to more clearly delineate what we do as engage both with realism, but also with, am I doing international political theory where realism is still a meaningful category, or am I doing military defense analysis, or am I doing like what I do, international political sociology, or where would you international history, conceptual history, right? If that makes sense, because it clarifies what exactly it is that we are doing vis-a-vis politics. And then we don't need to bash realism anymore, because realism is actually an important voice in the conversation. Tom Graham uses it, Mearsheimer uses it, and we can so Emma Ashwood uses it. Yeah, she's an interesting person. But I don't know, I mean, she's in the field because she knows about oil politics. She's not really in it because of IR theory, I would have said. Does that make sense? So it's not a great answer, but there's not a ton of IR theory, and I think that's a challenge for all of us to just reflect on our positionality vis-a-vis this thing and actually lean back into it in some ways, in its different modes. So Trump's politics on the Ukraine are very different from Biden's. I wouldn't suggest that he's actually getting his view that Putin is someone that we can do business with, that it's important that Ukraine is going to have to make territorial concessions. I don't think he's getting that from any Russia specialist, as far as I know. If he is, they're probably more like the Atlantic Council Center for European Policy Analysis, which is a sort of a Ukraine, Eastern Europe. They're not, I wouldn't say they're necessarily sort of bought out by those interests, but they're definitely sort of, those are the interests that they speak to. And that has become a more important dynamic, I think. He's obviously not speaking to them. I think he's kind of thinking on a whim, and then obviously that question of exactly how close he is to Putin, what are the kind of back channels going on, is something that's beyond my pay grade to answer. But that's Biden was being advised by Russia We Wanters, Tory and Newland for a long time, big critic of Putin. Matthew Carpenter. Let's just call him Matt, shall we? I think it actually is Matt. Was a long time major Russia person under Biden. So I think Biden was actually getting. It was more, as I've explained, the sort of the Russia We Wanters line still. But Trump's just getting on a whim, big man, great man politics. So interestingly, there is no Europeanists group in Washington, right? Like, because why do you need a Europe specialist? Why do you need Britishologists? I don't even know what the term would be. So there is no community of British or European policy makers, because everyone is they all sort of think of themselves as understanding Europe. We don't need that knowledge. So there is no knowledge community of which to speak. The question then is, will one actually develop? Will the Europeans fight? Will we fight amongst ourselves over how to try to impact Trump? You can see the Brits already kind of trying to go alone in their Anglosphere kind of thing. But of all the European countries, Britain's actually, interestingly, one of the ones that's kind of being more independent on its views of China and playing the old great game with Russia in a really strong way. So, and that is not an answer, but I don't think that dynamic's going to be in the knowledge politics space, because it kind of is it's almost an oxymoron to say the European specialists in DC, because you don't need them. But that's kind of interesting. Like, why do we? This goes back to a big point about why exactly we need China experts so much, because China expertise vastly outweighs any other country. You know, there's a few. I interviewed 52 Russian specialists, and that's a really decent chunk of them. I interviewed 150 China, and that was just scratching the surface. There's tens of thousands. I didn't even talk about the people in private business, Booz Allen Hamilton, the American Chamber of Commerce, the International Federation of Zoologists or something have like a ton of China expertise because pandas are amazing. Pandas threw my whole politics off. Yeah, I'll stop talking.
We have to land fairly soon. I have one last question for the whole panel, which is basically following up on some of the comments that have been made, which is there is a challenge, I think, for scholarly research, because the research that we do follows certain rules and methods. That's not necessarily what policymakers are interested in, and there are other providers of knowledge that are more attuned to the type of decisions and reflections that they engage in or want to engage in, which raises the question of what is then the role of proper academic research in shaping and informing policy and public debate going forward, particularly when the politics and the polarization are so intense. I think we'll start with the panel and then end with David. Who would like to go first?
All right, I'll go first. Those are just two different modes of operating. Heidegger talks about Nachdenken, you know, afterthought. And when you are in the thick of things, when you need to act, you act on what Kahneman would call thinking fast. Right? And when you sit in your study afterwards, in your armchair, as it were, you have the luxury of afterthought. So and you can think slow. Those are two very different ways of using your brain and two different ways of being in the world. So the question is, should people who specialize in the vita contemplativa, as Arendt calls it, should they also be in the vita activa? And my answer is yes. You make the point that some people ask the questions below the policy stuff. For example, to pick a totally random example, for example, the importance of Russia's need to be a great power. My experience is that it's only the really alert policymakers who are interested in that kind of thing, because most of them don't want to think for themselves. They don't want the building blocks to build their own analyses. They want the ready-made, masticated analysis, as it were. And playing that game is super hard because you need, for one thing, you need to compromise on your academic standards. You need to come down clearly on yes or no. If you start, it's complicated, get out of the room. I mean, you simply can't play the game that way. The other thing is that, and this is something that your book could have addressed a bit more. The other thing is that you are being pushed to talk about things you don't know anything about. All the time. So, and how far are you going to take that? Let me use myself as an example. I don't know the Middle East. I do know a thing or two about Russia and its demands. But with the concurrency of what happened in Gaza and Ukraine, a lot of the interest was about how those two played into one another. Now, if we'd had a specialist or two or five in this country on Middle East-Russian relations. I could have said, you have to call Anne. She's the specialist on that. We don't have them. So should I shut up or should I just talk outside of my comfort zone? And if you go too far in that direction, you're suddenly a pundit that nobody wants to listen to. So it's not easy. Final point, I worked in the foreign ministry in the job for 2 years where the remit was to give, one of the things I did was to give money to academics to write policy notes for the foreign ministry. And I said, you're going to get the money on 2 conditions. You will have a short resume of the major points, and you will have at least 1 policy recommendation. They couldn't do it. You know, you have to, at some point you have to ask the question. If you are a foreign ministry and you ask someone to come up with a policy sort of recommendation and they can't do it, why should you spend the money? So there's also a structural push towards actually engaging with this kind of stuff. So these are the dilemmas we live with.
Christian?
Yeah, I think I can just follow up, and we talked about this even a little bit before the seminar, right? That it's maybe not going in the right direction either, in the sense that at least, for younger scholars, earlier career, it's all about the academic output, right? And that's but that is a very separate sphere from the policy-making sphere, and maybe even more so than in Norway than in the US, or there is less of the revolving doors and more of the kind of trying to make your career in one place. At the same time, I do think that what we see, at least from the policy side in Norway, is a very clear interest in knowledge about Russia, not only academic but also academic, that still is something that they think is incredibly important for Norway to have, and a resource that they can then draw on when things happen or when they need to think new. So I still think that that's kind of like the clinging on to the fact that we talk a lot to a very different audience, but it's still important for policy making more generally in Norway to have that resource, knowledge as a resource.
Henrik?
Like Eva was saying, I think, I also think we do occasionally have to get our hands dirty and get into the business of policy, not just academics. But I think we have to be selective, of course, in which sort of battles we want to take. And I've sort of noticed this in the China field in Europe, and perhaps to some extent in Norway also. There's a lot of voices popping up, some sensible, some, in my opinion, perhaps less sensible, and you can't, you can't take all the debates. One sort of mode of engaging in debates that I think can be worthwhile for academics is to try to look at established terms, truisms that are entering, and, to examine whether they are really sort of backed up by evidence. I was kind of hinting at this a little bit in the opening remarks, but one area where I think there's been this unfortunate influence of the strategic competition narrative, partly from the US into Europe and Norway, is this idea that there is a intense strategic competition going on in the Arctic where China is taking part. I just don't think that is true and backed up by evidence. And I think, when policymakers are making claims that there are swarming of ships, Chinese warships outside of Greenland, I think it's important to come out and say, look, this is not backed by evidence. This is not the case. Do I think it's always possible to sort of break through this, sort of flow of a narrative, which, keeps popping up? In my opinion, it's a bit of a zombie idea. You can sort of put a knife in it and it will still just get back up again. But I still think it's important to try.
Yeah.
Okay, briefly, David, sorry, we're running out of time.
I'm just delighted to be able to stimulate that kind of conversation, because it's precisely what I've been living with for the last 10 years of trying to, trying to make some sort of intervention, knowing that these are two very different worlds. I mean, it's almost as if we could really use a course on ethics put together with sociology of expertise to try to give a newcomers to the international relations field a sense of this is the kind of things that you're going to be called upon to do, and you need to be aware of them and sort of be able to objectify them from the very beginning, and then develop an ethical kind of stance towards them. But I'll just leave that there. Thank you so much all for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, David, and thank you to thanks for coming.